When the war reached its darkest point in 1943, I learned something I never expected about human cruelty. Sometimes the smallest mistake, the tiniest misunderstanding, becomes the reason someone disappears into a room where screams don't escape. I wasn't supposed to be in Osaka that night. I wasn't supposed to see the Kempeitai dragging civilians out of the textile district after the air raid drills. I wasn't supposed to hear a young woman begging for mercy over something that, at first, sounded so absurd I thought I had misunderstood the language. They kept yelling that she couldn't make the green leaf. That was the phrase. Aoi no ha. The green leaf. And while the city trembled under the distant thunder of American B-29 reconnaissance flights, she trembled for a completely different reason. Because she had failed a task so simple, so bureaucratic, that no sane person would ever imagine it could cost someone their life. I wasn't a soldier then, not yet. I was a field observer, attached to a small intelligence liaison team, assigned to follow Japanese civilian movements in Osaka's industrial belt. My job was charts, reports, estimates on factory output, nothing dramatic. But the deeper we pushed into the city, the more we realized the Imperial machine wasn't powered only by steel and gunpowder. It was powered by fear. Fear enforced by men who believed brutality was just another tool in the arsenal of war. And the woman they dragged into that basement, she couldn't have been older than 20, was about to be crushed by that machine because of a piece of paper no larger than a soldier's pay stub. When I finally learned what the green leaf actually was, I understood why the Kempeitai were obsessed with it. It wasn't a leaf. It wasn't a symbol. It was a classification card. Mint green, stamped with ink, assigned only to civilians deemed reliable, obedient, and untainted by foreign influence. It was Japan's way of separating the loyal from the suspicious. And if you couldn't fill it out the way they demanded, if you misspelled a character, if your handwriting looked uneducated or inconsistent, you weren't considered harmless. You were considered dangerous. And in 1943, being considered dangerous in Osaka meant one thing: torture designed to break your mind before they broke your body. Before we dive deeper into what happened that night in Osaka, tell me something. Where are you watching this from? Are you somewhere on the East Coast? Maybe in a small town out in the Midwest? Could be you're on the West Coast. Maybe even near a base with aircraft history. Drop your city in the comments because I always want to know where these stories are traveling. And while you're down there, hit that like button if this opening already pulled you straight into the war. It shows YouTube that you want more American military history, more forgotten wartime intelligence missions, more stories buried under classified stamps for decades. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. There are incredible narratives coming, stories of American bravery, engineering, sacrifice, and missions most people have never even heard of. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now let's get back to Osaka, because what happened after they dragged her into that building changed everything. I thought I knew about wartime intelligence. I followed them from a distance, keeping my head down as the curfew horns echoed across the narrow streets. Osaka in 1943 wasn't like Tokyo. It didn't have the same polished military facade. It was a city built on sweat: steel mills, textile factories, food processing plants, shipyards along the harbor. At night, the entire district smelled like coal smoke, soy paste, and engine oil. The kind of smells that cling to your jacket for days. The Kempeitai patrol moved fast, shoving the girl forward every time she hesitated. She wore a faded work kimono, the kind issued in ammunition packing facilities. That alone told me she wasn't a spy. Spies aren't assigned 12-hour shifts counting explosive fuses and sealing powder bags. They don't spend their nights coughing from nitrocellulose dust. They reached an old warehouse at the edge of the canal. No signs, no markings. Just a single rusted door, and 2 guards smoking bitter tobacco. They pushed her inside. I waited 15 seconds, counted my breath, then slipped around the side of the building. There was a broken ventilation grate near the foundation, barely wide enough for my shoulder, but enough to let sound through. And that's when I heard it. Not a scream. Not at first. Just the sound of confusion. Her voice cracking as she tried to explain that she couldn't fill the green leaf form because she couldn't write kanji well enough. She wasn't educated. She wasn't guilty of anything except being poor. And in the eyes of the Kempe Tai, poverty was one step away from subversion. They wanted her to confess to something. Anything. Contact with Americans. Passing messages. Listening to forbidden broadcasts. They didn't care what the truth was. They wanted a story they could submit to their superiors. And when she couldn't give them one, the first blow echoed through that ventilation shaft like someone hitting a sack of wet grain. I felt my stomach twist. I'd heard torture before in this war, but this was different. This wasn't interrogation. This was punishment disguised as duty. I knew I couldn't stay by that vent forever. Patrols circled the district every 20 minutes, and if they found an American intelligence observer crouched behind a Kempe Tai black site, I wouldn't just disappear. I'd vanish into a pit so deep no one would ever find the bones. Still, I stayed long enough to hear the second phase begin. The girl's voice shifted from pleading to gasping, the kind of shallow breathing that comes when pain folds the lungs inward. They were questioning her about factory output, about missing detonator caps, about rumors of sabotage in the fuse assembly line. None of it made sense. She didn't look like someone capable of sabotage. She sounded like someone who didn't even understand the accusations. And yet the officer kept repeating the same line. If you can't make the green leaf, you must be helping the Americans. That phrase hit me harder than any weapon. Helping the Americans. As if inability and treason had somehow become synonyms. The Kempe Tai weren't looking for truth. They were looking for order. An order built on fear. The Japanese Empire at that point was cracking under pressure. American submarines were choking their supply lines. B-24 reconnaissance flights mapped their coastlines. And every bomb dropped across the Pacific forced them to tighten their grip on civilians. Anyone who failed a task, any worker who slowed production, anyone who didn't meet expectations became a suspect. The green leaf card was just another tool in their system of obedience, and she had failed it. That was enough to condemn her. I moved away from the building before the next patrol loop. Even from across the canal I could hear the thuds, the kind of rhythmic impacts that don't come from fists, but from wooden cudgels. There's a particular sound wood makes when it hits flesh, a deeper resonance, a vibration that crawls into your jaw. I had heard it in Burma. I had heard it in the Philippines. But hearing it happen to someone who didn't even know why she'd been taken, that lodged itself in my chest in a way I wasn't prepared for. I waited until the streets were empty, then slipped back toward our safe house to report what I had witnessed. My commanding officer didn't say much as I spoke. He just leaned back, tapped his pencil, and asked for one detail. Did they say what the green leaf was? When I gave him the answer, his expression didn't change, but something in the room did. We both knew what it meant. Japan had started labeling its own citizens as potential collaborators simply because they lacked education, and that meant the intelligence community couldn't trust any civilian report coming out of Osaka, not without checking whether the person giving it had been beaten into saying it. The next morning, we returned to the canals under the fog. Osaka always carried this humid industrial haze that clung to the water like a sheet. It made the whole district look ghostly. My team split in pairs. I circled the warehouse again. The guards were gone. The door was cracked open. Inside, the floor was wet, streaked with mop marks, and the metallic smell of blood thinned with water. A single shoe lay against the wall, women's cheap cloth torn along the side. No body, no detainees, no papers. They had moved her, just like they moved anyone they didn't want found. The Kempe Tai were experts at vanishing people into the civilian prison network that ran beneath Osaka's police system. But something else caught my eye. On a crate in the corner, half soaked, there it was, a green card, about 3 inches long, mint-colored, with faded black print in formal Japanese characters, a blank form. I picked it up with my gloves and scanned the layout. Section A, familial lineage. Section B, literacy certification. Section C, ideological reliability. It hit me immediately. Section B was the trap. If a civilian couldn't prove formal schooling, the officer assigned to the inspection could mark them as unable to complete. And being unable to complete a government form during wartime was enough to raise suspicion of sabotage. She wasn't tortured because she made a mistake. She was tortured because she was poor. That realization stayed with me. Long after we left the warehouse, long after we returned to the safe house, long after I filed the intelligence report. The cruelty wasn't random. It was systemic. It was engineered into the law. And as American aircraft tightened their grip on the Pacific, B-24s, B-25s, eventually the B-29 Superfortress, the Kempeitai tightened their grip on the people beneath them. The less control Japan had over the war, the more they strangled their own civilians. But this story doesn't end in that warehouse. Not even close. What happened next came weeks later, when Osaka shook under the heaviest bombing campaign Japan had ever experienced up to that point. American B-29s, monsters with 141-foot wingspans and bomb loads pushing 20,000 pounds, turned the night sky into a furnace. Their engines sounded like thunder rolling over metal. Every time they passed overhead, windows shattered, roofs caved in, and entire districts evaporated in sheets of fire. And somewhere in that inferno, in a prison we didn't yet know existed, that same girl was still alive. We found out because of a defect in the Japanese chain of command. When the bombs hit the northern industrial belt, many Kempeitai officers evacuated their posts without transferring detainees. That meant some prisoners were left locked in basements and cells that were never meant to survive an air raid. During the chaos, one of our forward scouts intercepted a panicked civilian fleeing the area. Someone who claimed to have heard a young woman screaming for help beneath a collapsed building near the canals. She had been imprisoned for failing government duties, he said. That phrase rang in my ears. Failing government duties. The green leaf. We reached the district just before dawn. Smoke rolled through the streets like ash-colored waves. The air tasted metallic, burned, heavy with the residue of incendiaries. Osaka's factories smoldered as far as the horizon. Warehouses split open, rail lines melted, steel frames sagging like dying animals. And beneath one of those frames, we found a door buried under debris. A steel door, reinforced, the kind used for high-risk detainees. We pulled until our gloves tore. The metal groaned open. Inside, the basement was pitch black except for the beam of my flashlight cutting through floating dust. And then we heard it. A cough. Faint. Weak. But alive. We pushed deeper. Chains hung from the beams. Rope restraints. A wooden cudgel still slick with dried blood. And in the corner, half-conscious, shaking, her wrists torn raw, was the same girl the Kempeitai dragged away for failing to fill out a card she couldn't read. Her eyes opened when she heard our footsteps. At first she recoiled, every instinct conditioned to expect pain. But then she saw the flash of our uniforms. American khaki in a room that had only ever seen black boots. She whispered something, barely audible. I leaned in. She repeated it with the last bit of strength she had. Did I make it? She wasn't asking if she survived. She was asking if she had done the task correctly, if her suffering had finally satisfied the men who tortured her. That broke something inside me. War destroys cities, armies, fleets. But the quiet way it destroys people is what lingers longest. We carried her out as the sun rose over Osaka's ruins. American aircraft were still circling far above, watching for retaliatory fighters. The girl weighed almost nothing. Bones under cloth. She held onto my sleeve with a grip so weak I could barely feel it, yet so desperate it felt like holding the last thread of a life trying to stay tethered to the world. We moved her to a temporary aid station set up inside what used to be an Osaka warehouse for ship-fitting materials. The building was half collapsed, burned along the roofline, and still radiating heat from the night's air raid. Medics worked in the shadows under torn canvas sheets, using crates as tables and whatever clean water they could find to keep the wounded stable. The girl didn't speak for the first hour. She just stared forward with a blankness that didn't come from shock alone. It came from having every scrap of dignity beaten out of her by men who believed obedience mattered more than humanity. When she finally whispered something, the medic beside me frowned. She was repeating the same phrase over and over. I couldn't make it. I tried. I couldn't make it. At first I thought she meant survival, but then I realized she was talking about that piece of paper. In her mind, everything she had endured came down to that card. 3 inches of mint-colored bureaucracy that determined whether she was considered loyal or treasonous. Her pulse was weak, her skin cold. She weighed maybe 80 pounds. The burns on her wrists were deep enough to show exposed tissue. And yet, despite all of it, she still believed she had failed them. That was the cruelty of the system. Pain wasn't the punishment. The punishment was convincing the victim they deserved it. I sat beside her for a long time, listening to the distant rumble of B-29s returning to their bases. Those bombers had done more than destroy Osaka's industrial capacity. They had fractured the infrastructure that hid victims like her. In a twisted way, American air power hadn't just targeted factories. It had ripped open the walls covering the Empire's darkest secrets. Later that night, while the fires still burned across the northern districts, an elderly man approached our station. He limped, leaning on a broken broomstick, clothes singed by the blast. He bowed and spoke softly. He said he knew the girl. She had worked in a munitions plant packing detonator caps for Type 89 grenades. 12-hour shifts, barely any pay, and she had never gone to school. Not once in her life. She didn't know how to write kanji for government forms. So when the Kempeitai appeared at the factory demanding literacy verification, she froze. They interpreted her fear as guilt. They told her illiteracy was sabotage. And then, they dragged her away. The old man lowered his voice as he described the plant. Rows of young women hunched over small metal cylinders, assembling fuses that weighed only a few ounces, but could tear a man apart in an instant. Workers were punished if they dropped one, punished if they worked too slowly, punished if they looked tired. The Empire needed detonators, so fear became the primary manufacturing tool. It wasn't efficiency. It was coercion. And the green leaf card was just another method of control. If a woman couldn't fill it out, she was labeled a threat. Not because she was dangerous, but because terror made production rise. We kept the girl under observation for 2 days. She barely ate, barely slept. Every time someone raised a hand to adjust bandages, she flinched. On the 3rd morning, she finally asked a question. Not about her pain, not about her future, but about her family. She wanted to know if they were safe. We didn't know. Osaka was chaos. Entire blocks were unrecognizable. Records were ash. All we could promise was that we would search. And we did. For hours. Through alleys filled with rubble and twisted iron. Through streets where entire houses had been flattened by 500-pound bombs dropped from 30,000 feet by superfortresses, whose wings cast shadows wider than the streets themselves. We walked through neighborhoods where firestorms had melted glass onto the pavement. But we found nothing. No registry sheets. No surviving neighbors. No clues. The war had swallowed her past the same way the Kempeitai had swallowed her present. As days passed, we prepared to evacuate north. American positions were shifting, and our intelligence cell needed to move before Japanese reinforcements reorganized. Before we left, I gave the girl the one thing that seemed to anchor her: the green leaf card we had found in the warehouse. It felt wrong to hand her the symbol of her suffering, but she took it with trembling fingers and held it against her chest. She whispered something I didn't expect. Now I know. I wasn't wrong. They were. Her voice cracked. For the first time since we found her, she cried. Not from fear, but from the realization that the Empire's judgment was a lie. She survived long enough to be transferred into American custody when the war ended. She never returned to Osaka. There was nothing left for her there. But the report we wrote, documenting the warehouse, the torture instruments, the green leaf classification system, the forced literacy tests, became part of the evidence used in post-war investigations into Kempeitai abuses. Her story, which began with a meaningless piece of paper, became a record stamped into the archives of war crimes. She had been a nameless civilian caught between an empire's desperation and the machinery of war. But through that suffering, she left behind a truth the Imperial system couldn't erase. When I think back on Osaka, I don't think of factories or bomb craters. I don't think of the canals or the smoke, or the nights when B-29 engines shook the walls like giants moving through the clouds. I think of her. A girl who wanted nothing but to survive another shift packing detonators. A girl who paid the price for an education she never had. A girl who believed she had failed, until the moment we showed her the truth. The Empire didn't torture her because she couldn't make a green leaf. They tortured her because fear had become their last weapon. And as I close this chapter, let me honor those who made it possible for her story to be told. The American aviators who flew through flak storms in aircraft like the B-29 Superfortress, carrying bomb loads that reshaped the trajectory of the war. The sailors aboard ships like the USS Iowa and USS Enterprise, whose courage in the Pacific forced oppressive systems into retreat. The Marines who fought island by island, mile by mile, under fire from artillery that shook the earth. And the countless engineers, mechanics, and builders who crafted the machines, aircraft with wingspans over 100 feet, bombs weighing 1,000 pounds, engines capable of pushing heavy metal giants through the sky, who made victory possible. Their strength didn't just win battles. It exposed the darkness nations tried to hide. It freed people who thought they would never be seen. It carried justice on steel wings and armored decks. And because of them, one girl from Osaka lived long enough for the world to know the truth.